You wake up, grab some coffee, maybe toast with eggs. Seems normal, right? But what if I told you that ancient Romans started their day by drinking wine? Not at night, at breakfast. And that's just the beginning of how weird Roman breakfast really was. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into what Romans actually ate for breakfast, and trust me, it's going to blow your mind. Let's start with the most shocking part: wine for breakfast. Romans didn't drink coffee or tea. Those didn't exist in Europe yet. Instead, they drank wine mixed with water. Even children drank this. Yes, you heard that right. Children drank wine in the morning. The wine was usually heavily diluted, but still, imagine giving your kid wine before school today. Now you might be thinking, what about food? Did they at least eat normal breakfast food? Not exactly. The Roman breakfast, or intaculum as they called it, was usually very light. In fact, many Romans skipped breakfast entirely. They considered it an optional meal. For wealthy Romans who did eat breakfast, it typically consisted of bread, cheese, olives, and sometimes dried fruit. But here's where it gets interesting. The bread wasn't like modern bread at all. Roman bread was dense, heavy, and often quite coarse. It could break your teeth if you weren't careful. They would dip this hard bread into their wine to soften it. Wine-soaked bread for breakfast. Now let's talk about the middle class and working Romans. Their breakfast was even more basic. Most workers would just grab a piece of bread, maybe dip it in olive oil, and head out the door. Some would stop at a street food stall called a thermopolium for something hot. These were basically ancient Roman fast food joints, and they were everywhere in cities like Rome and Pompeii. But here's the thing that really separates rich from poor in ancient Rome: the variety of food. Wealthy Romans had access to honey, imported fruits, expensive cheeses, and different types of bread. Poor Romans, they ate the same thing every single day: bread and maybe some cheap wine. Now let's talk about something that might actually make you gag: garum. Garum was a fermented fish sauce that Romans put on everything, including breakfast. Imagine the smell of rotting fish, but Romans loved it. It was like their ketchup. They would drizzle this pungent, salty liquid on their bread, cheese, and basically any food they ate. The process of making garum involved leaving fish guts and small fish in the sun for months until they liquefied. The smell was so bad that garum factories had to be built outside city limits because of complaints. But to Romans, this was a delicacy. The best garum could cost as much as expensive perfume. There were different grades of garum. The cheap stuff was for common people, the refined version for the elite. Now let's move on to another breakfast staple: pasca. Pasca was a drink made from watered-down vinegar. Yes, vinegar. This was especially popular with Roman soldiers and the working class because it was cheap and prevented disease. The acidity killed bacteria in questionable water, making it safer to drink than plain water in many cases. Soldiers on campaign would start every day with pasca and hard bread. That was their breakfast. Imagine marching 20 miles after drinking vinegar water and eating stale bread. That was Roman military life. For those who couldn't afford even basic bread, there was porridge. Specifically, a grain porridge called pulmentarium. This was made from wheat, barley, or other cheap grains boiled with water until it became thick and gloopy. Sometimes vegetables or small pieces of meat were added if you were lucky, but usually it was just plain grain mush. This porridge was filling and cheap, which made it perfect for feeding large families on a budget. Many Roman children grew up eating this porridge every single morning for years. Now, let's get back to the wealthy Romans and see what they were eating while the poor had porridge. Rich Romans might have cheese, and not just any cheese, but aged cheeses that were considered luxury items. They had access to fresh fruits like figs, grapes, and apples depending on the season. Dried fruits like dates and raisins were imported from across the empire and were very expensive. Honey was the main sweetener, and wealthy Romans would drizzle it on bread, cheese, and fruit. Some wealthy Romans even had eggs for breakfast, either boiled or fried in olive oil. But here's something interesting. Romans didn't usually eat meat for breakfast. That was reserved for later meals. The main meal of the day was dinner, called cena, which happened in the late afternoon or evening. Breakfast was meant to be light and quick, because Romans believed heavy eating in the morning made you sluggish. This is actually similar to intermittent fasting that's popular today. Romans accidentally discovered it 2,000 years ago. Let's talk about where Romans ate breakfast. Most people ate at home if they had one. Wealthy Romans ate in their atrium or dining room, often reclining on couches even for breakfast. But millions of Romans lived in crowded apartment buildings called insulae that didn't have kitchens. These people had to buy their breakfast from street vendors or go hungry. The thermopolium I mentioned earlier was crucial for these people. They served hot food from big clay pots. You could get lentil stew, bean porridge, or heated wine for just a few coins. There were literally hundreds of these establishments in Rome. Archaeologists have found over 80 in Pompeii alone. These weren't fancy places. You ate standing up at a counter, grabbed your food, and left. But for millions of Romans, this was their daily breakfast routine for their entire lives. Now let's talk about timing. When did Romans actually eat breakfast? Most Romans woke up at dawn with the sunrise. They didn't have alarm clocks, so they followed natural light. Breakfast, if eaten, happened shortly after waking up, usually within an hour of sunrise. This means in summer, breakfast might be at 5 or 6 in the morning. In winter, maybe 7 or 8. Romans didn't have artificial lighting like we do, so their entire schedule revolved around daylight. After breakfast, most people went straight to work. The workday started early and ended by mid-afternoon. Let's talk about children's breakfast in ancient Rome. Kids ate pretty much what their parents ate. Rich kids had access to better food, honey, fruits, and softer bread. Poor kids ate whatever was available. There were no special kid-friendly breakfast cereals or foods designed specifically for children. If the family had porridge, the kids ate porridge. If there was only bread, they ate bread. Roman children were expected to adapt to adult food from a young age, usually by age 5 or 6. School-age children would eat a quick breakfast and then head to school if their family could afford education. Most children from poor families didn't go to school. They worked or helped their parents from a young age. Now, here's something that might surprise you about Roman breakfast drinks besides wine and pasca. Milk was rarely consumed by adults in Rome. It was considered barbaric, something that northern tribes drank. Romans associated milk drinking with Germanic and Celtic peoples, whom they viewed as uncivilized. Cheese was fine because it was transformed, but straight milk, that was seen as primitive. This is ironic because today we think of milk as a normal breakfast drink, but Romans would have found that disgusting. Instead, as we discussed, they drank wine or pasca, sometimes just water if they were very poor. Fruit juices weren't really a thing either. Fresh fruit was eaten whole, not juiced. The concept of orange juice for breakfast wouldn't exist in Europe for over 1,000 years. Let's talk about seasonal differences in Roman breakfast. Summer and winter meals were quite different. In summer, breakfast might include fresh fruits, figs, grapes, and melons if you could afford them. Fresh cheese was more common in warmer months because it didn't keep as long. In winter, breakfast relied more on stored foods, dried fruits, preserved meats, and aged cheeses. Porridge was more popular in winter because it was hot and filling, perfect for cold mornings. Romans didn't have refrigeration, so food preservation was a huge part of daily life. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting were the main methods of keeping food from spoiling. This is why garum and salted fish were so common. They could last for months or even years. Now let's discuss the social aspect of Roman breakfast. Was it a family meal? For most Romans, breakfast was not a social occasion. It was eaten quickly, often alone. The main family meal was dinner in the evening. That's when families gathered and socialized. Breakfast was purely functional, just fuel to start the day. No lingering over coffee and conversation. This is very different from modern breakfast culture, where families often eat together in the morning. Rich Romans might have their slaves serve them breakfast in bed, but even then it was quick. The emperor and highest elites might have more elaborate breakfasts, but even they kept it relatively simple. Now let's talk about what gladiators ate for breakfast. These were professional athletes, essentially. Gladiators actually had a specialized diet. They were too valuable to feed poorly. Their breakfast often included barley, beans, and other high-carb foods to build muscle mass. They drank a special mixture called Gladiator grog, made from plant ash and vinegar for bone strength. Gladiators were called horderai, which means barley men because they ate so much barley. This high-carb diet made them strong, but also gave them a layer of fat that protected organs during fights. So gladiators started their day with basically ancient carb loading, similar to modern athletes before competition. Let's switch to Roman soldiers and military breakfast. Soldiers had very standardized rations. A soldier's daily grain ration was about 2 pounds of wheat or 3 pounds of barley. For breakfast, they would make this into bread or porridge and eat it with pasca. Sometimes they had lard, cheese, or salted meat, but grain was the foundation of every meal. On campaign, soldiers often had to bake their own bread using portable ovens or cook over campfires. A legion of 5,000 men would need several tons of grain every single day, just for breakfast and other meals. The logistics of feeding a Roman army were incredibly complex and required massive supply chains. Roman military success was partly due to their ability to keep soldiers fed, starting with breakfast. Now let's talk about priests and religious officials. Did their breakfast differ? Roman priests had certain dietary restrictions depending on which gods they served. Some priests couldn't eat certain foods or had to follow purity rituals before eating. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses who tended the sacred flame, had special dietary rules. But in general, most religious officials ate similar breakfasts to their social class. A wealthy priest ate like a wealthy Roman. A poor priest ate like a poor Roman. Religion influenced when you could eat and what you could eat, but breakfast remained fairly standard. Before eating, many Romans would make a small offering to their household gods, the lares. This might be a piece of bread tossed into the hearth fire, or a splash of wine poured on the ground. This daily ritual was part of breakfast routine, connecting the meal to spirituality and family. Let's discuss traveling Romans. What did people eat for breakfast when on the road? Roman roads were excellent, and there was a whole network of inns and rest stops along major routes. These places served simple food to travelers, usually bread, cheese, and wine, very basic fare. Travelers often carried their own food, dried bread that would last for days, dried fruit, nuts, and hard cheese. If you were wealthy, your slaves would prepare food at stopping points. If poor, you ate whatever you brought. The famous Roman road system meant that breakfast on the road was relatively predictable. You knew that every 20 or 30 miles, there would be somewhere to buy basic food and wine. Merchants traveling long distances would eat the same breakfast for weeks: bread, cheese, olives, and wine every single day. Now let's talk about sailors and Romans at sea. Naval breakfast was notoriously bad. Ships carried hard biscuits called panis nauticus. that were so hard they could chip teeth. These biscuits were baked multiple times to remove all moisture so they wouldn't spoil at sea. Sailors would soak these rock-hard biscuits in wine or pasca to make them edible. Fresh food spoiled quickly on ships, so after a few days at sea, it was all preserved food. Salted fish, dried fruit, and these terrible biscuits were the staples of naval breakfast. Water on ships often went bad, so diluted wine was essential for sailors, even more than for people on land. A Roman sailor's breakfast was probably the worst in the entire empire, even worse than poor city dwellers. Let's talk about slaves and their breakfast. This is where Roman society shows its darkest side. Slaves ate whatever their masters gave them, which was usually the cheapest food possible. Many slaves survived on bread, porridge, and whatever leftovers remained from their masters' meals. Some slaves worked in kitchens and might sneak better food, but this was risky and could be punished severely. Field slaves on farms had even worse diets, usually just grain, porridge, and water. The law actually specified minimum food rations for slaves, about 3 pounds of bread per day. But many masters ignored these minimums, and slaves had no way to complain. A slave's breakfast might be a chunk of hard bread and some water, eaten before a full day of hard labor. This brutal reality was normal in Rome. Millions of people started every day this way. Now let's flip back to the absolute top of Roman society, the emperor. The emperor's breakfast was obviously the most luxurious in the entire empire. Imported exotic fruits from Egypt and Africa, the finest wines from Greece and Italy. Fresh oysters brought in daily from the coast, pastries made with expensive honey and spices. The emperor could have literally anything he wanted for breakfast, food that most Romans never even saw. But interestingly, many emperors kept their personal breakfasts relatively simple by choice. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, reportedly ate plain bread and cheese for breakfast despite his wealth. Other emperors were known for their excess, hosting elaborate breakfast parties with entertainment. Nero supposedly had a different exotic breakfast every day, always trying to outdo himself. But even for emperors, breakfast was usually lighter than their main evening meal. The cultural expectation was that breakfast should be modest, even if you could afford more. Now let's talk about regional differences across the Roman Empire. Rome wasn't the only city. In Egypt, Roman citizens might incorporate local bread types and date palm products into breakfast. In Spain, olive oil was even more central to breakfast than in Rome itself. In Britain, the newest Roman province, locals mixed Roman breakfast customs with Celtic traditions. In Greece, breakfast habits were actually quite similar to Rome since the cultures were closely connected. The basic pattern was the same everywhere: bread, wine, or water, maybe cheese, but local ingredients varied. A Roman soldier stationed in Germany ate different breakfast bread than one stationed in Syria. The empire was huge, spanning from Britain to Iraq, and local food shaped breakfast everywhere. But the core Roman identity came through in breakfast habits. Wine-soaked bread was universal. Let's discuss how Roman breakfast changed over time throughout the empire's history. In the early Republic, breakfasts were even simpler, just grain porridge for almost everyone. As Rome conquered more territory, exotic foods became available, and breakfast options expanded. By the imperial period, wealthy Romans had access to foods from across the known world. Spices from India, dates from Persia, grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul. The variety available in Rome itself was staggering, but only if you had money. For the poor, breakfast remained essentially unchanged for centuries: bread, oil, maybe some wine. Economic inequality in Rome was massive, and nowhere was this more visible than at breakfast. A wealthy senator might spend more on one breakfast than a poor family earned in a month. Let's talk about the equipment and vessels Romans used for breakfast. Wealthy Romans ate from ceramic or metal plates and bowls, sometimes even silver for the richest. They drank from glass cups, ceramic cups, or metal goblets depending on wealth. Poor Romans used simple clay bowls and cups that were cheap and easily replaced when broken. Many of these vessels have been found by archaeologists and tell us a lot about daily life. At Pompeii, entire breakfast tables were preserved with food still on them when the volcano erupted. We can see exactly what people were eating in 79 AD on that terrible day. Bread, fish, fruit, and wine, the standard Roman breakfast frozen in time by tragedy. These archaeological finds prove that our understanding of Roman breakfast isn't just guesswork. We have physical evidence, written accounts, artwork, and preserved food to study. Roman writers like Martial and Juvenal wrote about breakfast in their poetry and satire. They complained about poor people eating smelly garlic breath in the morning, or joked about cheap wine. These writings give us insight into how Romans themselves viewed their breakfast culture. Now, let's talk about how Roman breakfast influenced later European culture. Many medieval European breakfast habits came directly from Roman traditions. Bread and wine for breakfast continued in Mediterranean countries for over 1,000 years after Rome fell. The concept of a light breakfast and heavy dinner remained standard in Europe through the Middle Ages. It wasn't until coffee arrived in Europe in the 17th century that breakfast drinks really changed. Even today, in Italy, Spain, and other former Roman territories, breakfast traditions echo ancient Rome. A simple coffee and pastry, or bread with olive oil, these are descendants of Roman intaculum. The Romans didn't invent breakfast, but they standardized it across a huge portion of the world. Let's discuss some specific recipes that have survived from ancient Rome. We have an ancient Roman cookbook called Apicius that contains some breakfast recipes. One recipe describes bread soaked in milk and fried with honey, an ancient French toast basically. Another describes mixing eggs, honey, and cheese into a kind of breakfast custard. There's a recipe for mortem, an herb cheese spread that was eaten with bread for breakfast. Modern historians and chefs have recreated these recipes, and some are actually quite good. The mortem recipe has become somewhat popular among history enthusiasts and food historians. It's made from fresh cheese, garlic, herbs like coriander and celery seed, and olive oil mixed together. You spread it on bread, and it's tangy, garlicky, and very flavorful, definitely better than plain bread. This kind of spread was common among farmers and rural Romans who had access to fresh cheese and herbs. Interestingly, elite writers rarely described breakfast in detail because they considered it boring. Most detailed breakfast descriptions come from complaints about poor people's food or jokes. This means we actually know more about common breakfast than wealthy breakfast in some ways. The everyday nature of breakfast meant writers didn't think it was worth describing thoroughly. Let's talk about breakfast and Roman medicine. How did doctors view the morning meal? Roman physicians, following Greek medical theory, believed in balancing bodily humors. They thought breakfast should be light to avoid creating too much heat and moisture in the body. Heavy breakfasts were considered unhealthy and could lead to lethargy and imbalance. Doctors recommended bread, mild cheese, and diluted wine as ideal breakfast foods. They advised against eating meat in the morning, saying it was too heavy and hard to digest. Galen, the most famous Roman physician, wrote that eating too much at breakfast made people stupid and slow. He recommended that most people eat very little in the morning and wait until midday or evening for larger meals. This medical advice reinforced the cultural practice of light breakfasts. So Romans weren't just eating light breakfasts from habit, they believed it was healthy. Interestingly, modern intermittent fasting research suggests they may have been partially right. Now, let's discuss breakfast entertainment and social aspects in wealthy households. Rich Romans sometimes invited friends or clients to breakfast meetings called salutatio. These were brief morning visits where business and social obligations were handled. Guests might be offered simple food and wine during these meetings. But this wasn't really about enjoying breakfast. It was about politics and networking. The actual eating was secondary to the social maneuvering happening during the meal. Some wealthy Romans used breakfast as a way to display their status to visitors. Having rare fruits or expensive cheeses at breakfast sent a message about your wealth. But again, Romans thought that anyone who made a big deal about breakfast was vulgar. True sophistication meant treating breakfast as unimportant, even if you could afford elaborate food. This is very different from modern breakfast culture, where brunch has become a social event. Let's talk about breakfast leftovers and food waste in Rome. Wealthy households produced significant food waste from breakfast and all meals. Leftover bread might be given to slaves or sold to poor neighbors. Some families saved stale bread and resold it at lower prices to the poor. Food waste from wealthy areas was sometimes collected by the very poor who survived on scraps. In a society with massive inequality, one person's trash was literally another person's breakfast. Archaeological excavations have found ancient Roman garbage dumps filled with food waste. These dumps tell us what people were eating and how much they were wasting. Poor people wasted almost nothing. Every crumb of bread was eaten or saved. The concept of throwing away edible food would have been incomprehensible to most Romans. Now let's discuss breakfast during special occasions and holidays in Rome. During Saturnalia, Rome's winter festival, normal social rules were reversed. Slaves might eat better breakfast during Saturnalia while masters served them. This temporary reversal reminded everyone of the social hierarchy by breaking it briefly. During religious festivals, special breads might be baked and eaten for breakfast. On someone's birthday, they might have honey cakes or special pastries with breakfast. But these special occasions were rare. Most days, breakfast was routine and unchanging. The monotony of eating the same breakfast every single day for years was normal. Variety in diet was a privilege of wealth. Most Romans never experienced it. Let's discuss the linguistic aspect of Roman breakfast culture. The Latin word intaculum literally means breaking of the fast. This is the same concept behind the English word breakfast. The word prandium referred to lunch, and cena was dinner. Interestingly, Romans had specific words for different types of bread and wine. The vocabulary around food was quite sophisticated, reflecting its importance in culture. Slang terms existed for cheap food and wine, just like modern slang for junk food. The phrase panem et circenses, meaning bread and circuses, referred to how emperors kept people happy. Free bread rations were so important that they were mentioned alongside entertainment. This linguistic evidence shows that bread, including breakfast bread, was political and social, not just food. Now let's talk about the transition from Roman breakfast to medieval European breakfast. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, breakfast habits didn't immediately change. People still ate bread and drank wine in the morning because that's what they'd always done. Gradually, over centuries, regional differences emerged as the unified Roman culture fragmented. In Italy and Spain, Roman breakfast traditions continued with minimal changes. In France and Germany, local customs mixed with Roman traditions to create new breakfast cultures. In Britain, after Roman withdrawal, breakfast habits shifted back toward Celtic traditions. But the basic pattern of bread and fermented drinks for breakfast persisted across Europe. It wasn't until the Columbian Exchange brought new foods to Europe that breakfast really transformed. Coffee, chocolate, potatoes, tomatoes, and corn all changed European breakfast eventually. But for over 1,000 years after Rome fell, people were still essentially eating Roman-style breakfasts. Let's discuss modern attempts to recreate and experience Roman breakfast. Historical reenactors and experimental archaeologists have tried to live on Roman diets. Most report that the breakfasts are surprisingly filling despite being simple. The bread, while hard and coarse, provides solid energy for physical work. Diluted wine in the morning is strange for modern people, but becomes normal after a few days. Garum is the biggest challenge. Most modern people find it repulsive at first. But some people who persist with it say they eventually acquire a taste for it. Several restaurants and museums offer Roman breakfast experiences for tourists. These usually sanitize the experience, offering modernized versions of Roman food. A truly authentic Roman breakfast would be too challenging for most modern palates. We're spoiled by variety, sugar, and processed foods. Simple bread and wine seems boring now. But for Romans, this breakfast was normal, expected, and completely satisfying. Let's discuss how Roman breakfast relates to modern food culture and what we can learn. Romans understood that breakfast should be quick and functional, which resonates today. They ate locally and seasonally out of necessity, which modern foodies now embrace by choice. The Roman practice of light breakfast aligns with intermittent fasting trends. Their use of fermentation for food preservation is experiencing a modern revival. However, the massive inequality in Roman breakfast culture is something we should avoid emulating. In Rome, your birth determined your breakfast for your entire life. There was almost no social mobility. Modern society still has food inequality, but it's not as rigid and unchangeable as Rome. We can appreciate Roman ingenuity with food, while recognizing the injustice of their social system. The Roman breakfast reminds us that food is never just food. It's always cultural and political. What you eat, where you eat it, and who you eat with all carry social meaning. Now let's wrap up with some final thoughts on Roman breakfast culture. For over 1,000 years, millions of people started their day with wine-soaked bread. They thought this was completely normal. Just as we think coffee and cereal are normal. Roman breakfast was shaped by their agriculture, their values, their social structure, and their available technology. They made the best breakfast they could with what they had, just like every culture does. Some aspects of Roman breakfast were genuinely innovative and ahead of their time. Other aspects, like the garum obsession, remain bizarre even with cultural context. The divide between rich and poor breakfast was stark and morally troubling. But the basic human need to start the day with food has been constant across all cultures and all time periods. Roman breakfast wasn't better or worse than modern breakfast. It was different. Understanding how and why Romans ate what they did helps us understand how and why we eat what we do. Food history is human history. Breakfast history is the history of how civilizations begin each day. And Rome began each day with wine, bread, and the energy to build an empire that changed the world forever. If you found this deep dive into Roman breakfast fascinating, make sure to hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more ancient history content that brings the past to life. Drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most about Roman breakfast. Was it the wine, the garum, the inequality? Let me know your thoughts. Next time you have breakfast, think about the Romans doing the same thing 2,000 years ago. Different food, same human need. That connection across time is what makes history so powerful. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you in the next video where we explore more fascinating aspects of ancient life.